Thank you for joining us. We are continuing in the book of Mishlei, Proverbs, written by King Solomon, where we go through the wisdom of King Solomon. We're already up to chapter 30, which is the penultimate chapter of the book, which means we're very close to the end of the book. So Proverbs chapter 30. King Solomon introduces himself, and his name gives himself away. There's a different name that he has. Chapter 30, verse 1, Divrei Agur ben Yakeh, the words of Agur ben Yakeh. And the rabbis say, why is his name Agur? Because Agur means to gather, to contain. And so he contained all the wisdom that his teachers taught him. And Yakeh means someone who sort of spits out their wisdom. So King Solomon shares his wisdom. This is the word of God for Itiel. Itiel means God is with me. So King Solomon's name is Itiel. And I can. When God is with me, I can. Kibar anochi meish. I am not as wise as Moses. Velo binat adam li. I do not have the wisdom that Moses possessed, because the wisdom that Moses had was wisdom of revelation, as opposed to the wisdom of King Solomon, which was more intellectual. Lo binat adam li. I don't have the wisdom of Moses. Velo lamadati bina, velo lamadati chokhmah v'dat kedoshim eda. I did not learn wisdom the way Moses did from God, and the word of the righteous I do not know. Why can't I, Solomon, compete with Moses? Why is it that Moses has this huge advantage over King Solomon, who is the wisest of men? Why is it that he has this advantage? So he says, Mi ala shamayim ve'yerad. Who is it that ascends to the heaven and then comes down? Mi asaf ruach bechofnav. Who is able to gather wind in his hands? Mi tzar mayim basimna. Who is able to gather water in clothing? Obviously, you can't do things. Mi yakim kolaf se'aretz. Who is able to rise up an entire nation? Mashmo umashem beno kiteda. What is his name? And the answer, it is Moses. So the reason Moses is more informative than Solomon is because Moses has a revelation at Sinai and King Solomon doesn't. And so he says, every word of God is distilled to purity, and God shelters those who trust in him. King Solomon is saying, I'm smart, but I can't compete with Moses, who had a revelation at Sinai. There's nothing that beats prophecy. There's nothing that beats what Moses had at Sinai. Al tosef al varav. Do not add on the words of God. Yes, excellent. Thank you. I'd like to thank everyone that's with us here. Thank you. Yes. Don't add on the word of God, of the words of God, because what you can understand intellectually can never compare to revelation. Lest you be proven wrong. So don't add on the commandments of God. And now King Solomon says in verse 7, yes, thank you, yes. So King Solomon says something very beautiful, chapter 30, verse 7, he says, God, I'm asking for you for two things. If you had two wishes you can ask from God, what would be your two wishes? You ever think about that? What would be your two wishes if you can ask God for two wishes? So he says, actually, one of these wasn't granted, but here is King Solomon's wish. First is, Shav udvar kazav archek mimeni. Do keep falsehood and things that aren't true away from me. And Shav udvar kazav archek mimeni. Keep falsehood away from me. Resh v'osher al titenli. Do not give me a huge amount of money, but what I ask you do give me is hatrifeni lechem chuki. Give me the bread that I want. Why is it not good to be too rich, and why is it not good to be too poor? So King Solomon says, here is the dilemma. If you become too rich, you become so satiated and happy and content with what you have that you forget where it came from. And you say, who's God? I never heard of him. Because you feel like you have it all. You don't need God. So So what you say is, if you get too much money, you're like, okay, I don't need God. If you don't have any money, you may commit financial dishonesty. You may steal. Maybe I'm going to take something that's not mine. And I'll swear by God falsely. So King Solomon says, you have a dilemma. You become too rich, you deny God. You become too poor, you commit dishonesty. So that's why King Solomon says to God, all I want is give me the bread that I need. That's all. Fulfill my need. And they have studies on this, how happiness actually maxes out with a certain amount of money. They have studies that if you're making way below the average, you're not doing great. If a person's making the average salary, they have their basic needs met. Any money that's added to that will not make them happier. In fact, in many cases, it will make them more miserable. So that's what he's asking God. Those are his two wishes. Verse 10, Al talshen eved el adonav peni kalelcha ve'ashamta. Never, ever, ever. So the literal translation is never turn in a slave who escaped back to his owner, which is a commandment that's found in the Torah, in the 5 books of Moses. But there's another meaning here, which is King's based on the commentaries, he's saying, don't give away judgment to God. Meaning, sometimes people turn to God and they say, God, please punish that person. What do you think happens when a person says, God, please punish that person? God says, wait, who are you? Why are you so righteous that I should spare you? So before you think of passing on judgment to God, deal with it yourself, solve it yourself, because if you pass judgment, if you say, God, please smite that person, God, please teach that person a lesson, then you will find yourself, under God's examining eye. Lest that person curse you, and then you will be found guilty. Verse 11, Do aviv yekalel ve'et imo lo yevarech. He says a generation that is worthy of destruction is a generation that, excellent, very good, thank you, yes. So a generation that curses their own father and mother is a generation that will never be blessed. And that sometimes feels like, every generation for the past 100 years, generation that sort of looks back on their parents and looks down at them. Next, verse 12, Dor tahor be'einav u'mitzvato lo uchat. A generation that is pure in its own eyes is a generation that looks down on their parents. Sometimes people are so, they're such Puritans that they're like, oh, I'm so great, my parents are terrible people. And that is actually an indication that the child is guilty. If you have a generation of young people that say, we are so much better than our parents, and they curse their parents, then that's not a good generation. Obviously, you have cases where this is okay. When in Germany after the Holocaust, when people said to their parents, you guys did a horrible thing, that obviously is a good thing because, it was objectively horrible. But generations that just look down on the older generations, usually not a good thing. And on that, King Solomon says, verse 13, Do maramu enav, their eyes are very haughty, they're high, and his eyelashes are always looking on high. Do charavot shinav, this generation that curses its parents, that acts with arrogance, is a generation whose teeth are like swords, and his jaws are gobbling everything up, and they destroy the poor, and they will hurt those who are poor and eradicate them. Now, King Solomon now speaks. A lot of people say this speaks about taxes. No one likes taxes. So King Solomon says, La lukashte banot. The leech has 2 daughters. Hav, shalosh hena lo tisbana, arba lo amruhon. There are those who will never be satiated, and one of them is taxes, no matter how much you give. Next is an example of something that won't be satiated. You ever seen a video, or actually were you maybe ever there, where you look over a cliff and look down into the abyss? So that abyss, no matter what you put in, is never going to be filled. Sheol ve'otzer rechem, eretz lo sav'a mayim. Things that are never ever going to be satiated is the Sheol, the abyss, and the Otzerechem, the a woman whose womb is not producing. She's not able to have kids. Eretz losav amain, and a land. Sometimes, if you look at a desert when it rains, sometimes the rain just won't get absorbed because the land is so dry. Ve'esh lo amra eretz losav amain ve'esh lo amra hon. And sometimes you have a fire that's never ever going to stop consuming because it's always ready to consume more. What else is always ready to consume more? Ein tilag le'av. Ein tilag le'av. An eye that mocks its own father, v'tavuz le'ikatem, and that looks down on its own mother, yikua or venachal. That eye that's always looking down on the previous generations is going to be pecked by the ravens, and the eagles are going to eat it. So that is the idea of being conveyed here, that there are certain things that are never going to be satiated. God willing, we will continue verse 18 tomorrow. I really, really want to thank everyone who's been with us. I very much appreciate you, your questions, your comments, and God willing, next week we probably will finish the entirety of the book of Mishlei. Thank you so much for joining us. Wishing you a beautiful day. I will see you tomorrow. Le'itraot. Yom Tov to all.